Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a nice break, got some snacks, got some coffee, water, good conversation. I am very excited to have our WTF panel. Definitely the acronym came before I chose the words, but it is very much on brand, web tools and frameworks. Basically, it's WTF, our ecosystem is huge and big and complex, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So today I have 4 incredible panelists. We've got Divya here, who is a platform engineer at Fly.io, and works on building a better infrastructure with better design. Accurate? Yeah. Cool. We have Matt here, who is CEO and co-founder of Netlify. As you all likely know, Netlify is a platform to build, deploy, and scale for the modern web. He's been building dev tools for more than 30 years and coined the term Jamstack. And if you're not going to go to Jamstack Conf, I highly recommend you do. And if you want to, well, first of all, because I'm speaking, so, that's why you would attend. But you get a 40% off discount for attending DEX. So use the code DEX, D-E-X, 40. And if you're attending here, you'll get a 40% discount for Jamstack Conf. Thank you, Matt.
It'll be a lot of fun.
We also have Eli here, who has been founding SaaS companies for over 10 years.
Just a string of SaaS companies.
Just all of them. And is the CTO of Codecov, which enables over 1 million devs to improve code through test coverage.
Through test coverage.
See,
and code quality.
I got it.
All those fun things, yeah.
All of the things. And then, of course, we've got Ben here on the end, who has been a UI dev, UI front-end web dev for over 15 years, is currently a front-end architect at Stitch Fix, and helps design systems and front-end infrastructures.
Hello.
So thank you all for coming. Please, we are inviting questions both from Discord. I've got a text thread with our Discord moderator here. So if you're on Discord, please feel free to ask questions there. And then, of course, if you have questions in the audience, we'll have mics around. The first question I have for you all, though, and this won't be like each of them will answer, so there might just be general conversation after I get out of the way, is kind of around this idea of when, how, and for what are we deciding what frameworks and tools we're going to use. And so, we've talked a little bit about, we heard David in the morning saying that the developer experience is really about writing, testing, deploying, /shipping, and maintaining code. Do you think about those pieces when you're choosing a framework or a tool set? And how do those parts of being an engineer factor into choosing the right framework?
You want first?
Please.
I'll break the ice here. The very first thing for me is what does the problem demand, right? And so depending on what I want to solve or I want to solve it, that can actually make a lot of the sort of language framework decisions for you, right? If I'm building something that requires high concurrency, for example, a lot of real-time interaction, maybe I'm reaching for Elixir. If I'm building something that has to go very, very fast, maybe I'm writing it in Rust. If it's web or server-side, maybe Golang, right? If it's a language I work in all the time because I want to move very fast, I'm going to pick PHP, which has come up a couple of times already. And so the first thing there is definitely like what is the problem demand? After that, everything else can kind of fall out from that question. It's my approach anyway.
That's also always the questions of like, are you taking short-term or long-term decisions? And it's very different if you're building a quick prototype or if you're building a one-off microsite where you might actually really want to pick something that you can experiment with and take new conclusions from and drive from. Or when you're sort of setting a core foundation for an app that teams of developers are going to be collaborating on for years, right? Like, it's pretty different considerations that comes into those two aspects. And totally agree on always focusing a lot on like what are you actually solving for before reaching for any specific tool or any specific framework. And then thinking through, like, again, whether this is like a learning opportunity for the team where you want people to be able to push the boundaries a little, or whether this is a moment where you need to be predictable in execution, where you really want to pick something that you've tried building with before.
Yeah, it's just your collaboration point's really important. Like one of my favorite things I think about when I'm choosing a framework or building something early is just don't be clever. Just don't. I think that you hear the term innovation tokens and this kind of thing, like where are we going to spend our innovation tokens when we're solving a problem for the first time? But like, if you think about building something that you want to tack a team onto, and that team comes on and says, hey, why did you choose X? And if your answer is, oh, I thought it was cool, that's like probably not the best justification. And so keep it simple where you can, keep it straightforward where you can, especially if you're moving quickly and prototyping and that kind of thing. Like reach for as much as you can that already exists that people know about. But yeah, otherwise, pick and choose your battles. Remember to be clever.
We've usually we've usually picked frameworks for hiring purposes too, because like there are times when you pick, I don't know, so at Fly we have written in Elixir and Phoenix, which is great, but it's sometimes really hard to find people to join because it's like, oh, we're writing in this framework that most people likely are not writing in, and this is not a jab at the framework we chose because it's really powerful. But oftentimes that comes into play as well because you're like, oh, we're gonna build this thing in Rust, but it's like, great. You're not gonna find a lot of engineers who have like 5 to 10 years of experience in Rust because likely that's not gonna happen. So that tends to be something that we think about as well. Just like, I think the longevity question is also important. Just like, okay, we're building this tool right now in this particular framework or language, but then 5 years from now, are we going to hate this thing that we're working on? Or is it gonna be easier to like migrate and work on for future engineers who join or people who continue to work on it to be?
Yeah, I'd like to zero in on that people aspect because the people is just as important as the technology, right? You can pick the best technology, but if the people can't use it, then it doesn't matter. So their current experience is also important of what people can use right now versus what's the best one in a vacuum. So both of those things are important. Where you're at right now matters for what you're going to pick next.
Yeah.
There's also now, especially in like larger settings, larger scale companies, right? Like a lot of movement towards the idea of composable architectures, which I think is interesting because like the risk is that with the sort of traditional monolithic stack, the kind of scope of your choice of a framework is like, this is what we're going to build everything with forever, right? Like, and that's a very hard choice to get right? Like, because most likely 2 years, 3 years from now, at least in some parts of that stack, other frameworks, other tools will have like wildly out-innovated the monolith you are on. So this idea of composable architectures, I think, is very powerful. Can you find clear demarcation lines where your choice could be like encapsulated better? Can you cleanly decouple like the web UI layer from any of your backend choices? Can you take different choices from the part of your backend that requires really high concurrency throughput network versus the part of the backend that's really about like building a CRUD interface for business operation and where you would want good domain modeling and good understanding of like business flow and so on? Can you find even off-the-shelf tools for some of those endpoints that you can just go by and not have to build, maintain, and operate yourself? I think that mindset of leaning in towards composability is one of the really powerful movements now that makes some of these framework choices a little like, that can help you de-scope them from being a choice of everything to a choice of like, for this specific problem, what are we going to use? Then balanced with like the complexity, and you can then end up with if you keep choosing a different answer to that question for every single piece of your stack, and suddenly developers have to understand 15 different tools and frameworks and languages.
Yeah.
There's an intentionality to it, right? Like if I'm starting out, if I'm a one-person operation growing a business, or maybe I'm doing some skunkworks thing inside a larger company, I want to move as fast as possible, and sometimes the monolith is the right answer, right? Like one of my core beliefs when you're working at that level is like, don't solve a solved problem. If you're sitting there trying to figure out how to make your auth work, when auth has been solved a million times in a million other frameworks, you're wasting your time. And so monolithic frameworks can help you solve those problems quickly, but you have to be intentional, right? Because Mathias, you're absolutely correct, right? Like being able to compose your architecture down the line becomes incredibly important. Like this endpoint is slow, well, it's in the monolith and it has this dependency and that dependency, this other dependency. Like I can't pull it out, I just have to deal with it. These are problems that you don't want to have to solve later unless you absolutely have to, but you also don't want to trade that speed off at the beginning. And so grab a framework, know what's going to suck as you grow, and be very intentional about replacing that as you move forward in time. I think that can, I don't want to say best of both worlds, because that can be a disaster as well, but like it can give you a good starting point for scaling quickly when you need to move fast as an individual versus how to make things better when you need to optimize.
Yeah. I wanted to ask this question to this group of people in particular because I feel like when we're focused on our role as an engineer, an IC engineer, then a lot of these decisions, maybe we don't understand. Like you just joined a company and you're like, why the heck are we using this framework? Like this does not seem like it'll be fast enough, or this seems like it's not going to scale enough, or whatever. And so being able to understand from the perspective of engineering leaders, of people who've built companies and who've influenced infrastructure, I think it's important that we all understand that there's so much complexity in just that choice from the beginning. We talked a little bit about this from the framework perspective. How do tools play a role here? Do you take that same approach with tools? Is it not as critical choice there?
So how are you defining tools exactly?
That's the best question ever. Don't ask me anything. I'm not on the panel. No. I mean, I think it could be a combination of things, right? Like it could be your tools for deploying, right? It could also just be your literal editor. It could be the choice of what computer are you buying for your engineers, right? Like I think that there's a lot to it, and I think that there's probably levels of it, right? But when I first joined Microsoft recently, there wasn't a requirement for a particular operating system, for example, right? But when when I was at GitHub, I was working on client applications, and so everyone in the company used a Mac except for my team because we were building GitHub for Visual Studio, so we had to have both, right? And so I think it can be kind of anywhere within the stack, and that's kind of the question, like how much do you need to think about those things ahead of time?
Yeah, I can go first here. Like I think it on the first rule, you want to really trust your developers to pick the best tools for their job, right? Like, so you want to really give them power to choose how they want to solve problems and so on. Then on the flip side, you want developers to also be able to work across different teams in your organization, right? Like, so if every single team has a completely different way of deploying and doing code coverage and running their code, and it will be very hard for anyone to help out another team, right? Like they'll be lost in a completely different set of tools and they'll be handicapped. So all of this comes down to how do you balance the ability for your developers to have agency to take choice anywhere where they can, while still standardizing enough on the core tools you have that one, people can jump from project to project, and two, a new project also comes with a bunch of decisions that's already taken, so you don't have to spend all the time reinventing the wheel for your basic tooling.
So then how do we figure out that balance? Like how do you decide which tool is okay for everybody to have and which tool needs to have that consensus, right?
I think you just hope somebody's decided for you already.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard, right? And I think first and foremost for me, if it's tool selection, and this is the obvious one, the tool has to work, right? Yeah. Like if I'm sitting here, if it doesn't work for my use case, or I'm fighting it, or there's times where different teams can't onboard to it the same way, it's probably not worth keeping. Yeah. And I think a lot of the decisions that I tend to make around, do we in-house this problem? Do we buy a tool for this problem? Is kind of how repeatable is it across my teams? How much do they have to think about it, and how do we have to use it? Because almost worse than in-housing something is adopting a tool that you have to leave behind in 3 months, right? We went through all these negotiations, we paid for all these contracts, we went through all this proof of concept and security and yada, 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 and now it's gone. And so the longevity of the tool is important if I'm choosing for the team, and then the ability to not fight it, to have multiple teams adopt it, right? And that just comes down to choose good tools, right? And that process is hard, and I don't think I answered your question. I just made it harder. But ultimately, like, let's choose good things that we know scale, and then keep those in our toolkit for as long as possible.
Well, and I think, real quick, there's this interesting kind of conversation happening here, which is choosing the right tools, like trusting your engineers, and to go back to the things that I keep mentioning, tools should be integrated into your developer workflow. So thinking about, what are your different teams, what are their what is their workflow that is needed to be able to ship your product, and then what tools kind of match that, and then hopefully across teams, right? And Divya, I know that you and I had a quick chat, and you were talking about needing to jump across like so many different projects. Maybe you can have some insight into this.
Well, so I work at a small company, so this is kind of part of the process of that. But I see picking tools as a trial and error process, because you can't optimize from the get-go, like this is the tool that's going to be perfect for everybody. And so the nice thing is when you're at a smaller company, there's a lot more opportunity to do that. So you can start by being like, this is what we're going to do, and this is how people are going to work. And then you see over time how that doesn't work or if it works. And to give you an example, like when I joined as a platform engineer, we had to build one of our code bases on a Linux machine. And I had a Mac, so I basically had to get a nuke, or however you say that word, and like boot Linux on top of it, and then always SSH into it, pull my code, run it, and then deploy from there, which like worked when we were a team of 2 on the platform team. But as we started scaling, we were like, this is not sustainable. We had to write a giant doc to explain like, this is how you do system cuddle stuff and containered and like all of these things that most people are like, I just want to run this code. I don't care about all the extra pieces of like how exactly it boots. Right. And so then we had to think through like, okay, now we have to fix that tool. The tool worked when in the early stages, and even then it was really clunky. But at the point where we want, like Mathias was saying, more people to work on the tool, we're like, okay, we need to have like some kind of vagrant setup so people can just like use that instead of having to boot on their own. And so then tools sort of change and mutate as the team grows and changes, which I think is the beauty of it. So I think like tools are not in stasis all the time. It's like it works until it doesn't work, and then there's like a plethora of other tools to pick from, and you're like, okay, you can pick because it's like more ergonomic, or the pricing works better because the team is bigger and the pricing model doesn't work anymore. And so there's all these trade-offs that you can make, and sometimes engineers themselves have the power to do that, and then other times it's kind of like more top-down.
And then back to the idea of like composability and relatively simple tools that can work together versus like very big monolithic tool solutions that are interdependent and where you can switch out the initial pieces. And a very similar approach is with picking your framework and writing your code of like, don't be too clever. If your tool tries to be too clever, it's typically also has some edge cases where that doesn't work, and suddenly it takes a very long time figuring out what it was trying to do for you and why it's not working. So I'm generally a fan of anything that's simple in the sense of being easy to reason about. Like, what is this tool actually doing, and what's going to happen when it doesn't do the right thing?
So, like, one of my roles, or I guess our whole team, is to build tools for all of the other engineers at Stitch Fix. So we're always thinking about what's the best tool to use, and the way we do it is like, okay, what's the biggest problem that engineers have? Okay, how can we solve it and create something consistent? So for instance, code editor is not one of the biggest problems. So I pick VS Code personally, but we're not gonna make everybody else do that. Whereas, how do we develop React applications consistently so then we'll build a design system, and that's the tool that teams use across everything, as opposed to having to write their own React components and style them. So it all just depends on the expertise of the people there and what the problems are that they're running into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When do you decide build versus buy on your team? Is it this thing like if it's the hardest problem, we're just going to build it, or like what? How do you pick?
It depends on the cost of having to build it and having to maintain it. So not just build, but also maintain, and whether or not we have the expertise. So if we're looking to deploy code and Netlify already exists, well, let's just use Netlify, and there it is. We have our Jamstack application. Why have to rebuild everything in AWS, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's a design system and we want our design to look a specific way, okay, then we'll build it ourselves instead of pulling something off the shelf.
You made a point earlier about the composability of tools, right? But do you not feel like as organizations get bigger, all tooling trends toward a monolith? Like, look at comprehensive solutions like Datadog or even like Harness. This is CI tool that's coming along. Like, these try to give you that all-in-one out-of-the-box solution that I feel like we try to gravitate toward as we're getting bigger and just want like the all-in-one solution. You think it's a good idea?
I think it's true that there's real tension there. That even as an ecosystem of APIs and services, we haven't quite nailed yet. Even from a perspective of how do we sometimes sell and collaborate together, because otherwise we often get in that situation where it's not so much that the developers want everything in one tool, as it is as a buyer. You don't want to have to deal with buying like 15 different tools from a relatively simple perspective, right? Like, so I do think that when tools turn into paid services, they need to, in the current environment, take on a certain amount of gravity and include more and more things just to make it simpler to do the whole like buying management. I think every one of us at scale, if we look at the amount of SaaS bills we're paying every month, it becomes pretty unwieldy to manage, right? Like, so there's a pure layer of like, how do we keep down the complexity of that leads us towards more monolithic solutions. And then there's like the opposite path to like, okay, how can we actually make sure that we don't get stuck in a solution where the individual pieces over time just get completely out-innovated by the ecosystem because we are over-indexing on buying from one vendor versus actually getting best in class.
You thinking like a system of services could ever beat the monolith? Like just from the billing and the friction, like, I don't know if there's anything we could do independently to beat a monolith. Yeah, it's tough.
It also seems like perhaps as you start to grow and you need to start, to your point, like not having to write 10-page docs on how to use each of the tools. And so you want to have, again, tools integrated into your developer workflow. You should just record that and replay it every time. But truly, then you might start to say, okay, you do have to use VS Code because these have these 10 extensions and it's just going to work. And if you choose something else, fine, but you're on your own. I'm not going to write docs for, maybe not that mean, but still, right? Like, I think that as you start to grow in the complexity of your tool set, and yes, there's the buying and the kind of, keeping track of it all, but there's also just the reality of like a new engineer on your team and getting them ramped up so that they can push code, in 30 days.
And we're not even discussing the security aspect of that yet, of just like, hey, we're a small security team. Can we all please use one operating system? Like, please make my life easier. Which is, conversations we've had at Codecov before. Like, and that's a whole nother layer of complexity that pushes you toward the monolith of like services and tools, right? It's one SOC report, it's one approach. It pushes you toward unification of your dev tools. For better or worse, you're just kind of constrained by the resources you have, right?
Yeah, it's true. As a reminder, you all are welcome to ask questions. Oh, there's a question up in there in the back. Do we have mics? Thank you.
Yeah, just
well, we want to do it for the live stream too. Yeah. And also just in case, we can be patient. Almost. Good. You should be good now.
Yeah, there we go. Are you guys familiar with the golden path and kind of the mentality of the golden path? How do you prevent the golden path from limiting freedom?
can you though? Really? Like, isn't that the whole point of the golden path? No, I mean, the golden path, the paved road, kind of that terminology. We're ultimately a developer tool at Codecov. We get into CI space. We get into the workspaces of.
Do you want to explain what the golden path is?
Yeah, I mean,
real quick?
it's the collection of tools and processes and frameworks that are the easy ways to onboard in a growing organization, right? Like, these are the things we say you should use. It's the paved road, the easiest way to get to your destination, this kind of thing. And this comes up a lot with us selling into Codecov, and the conversation we typically have is, okay, how do we get you on the golden path, right? How do we make Codecov the tool that everybody has to use? And I think by definition that kind of creates friction, right? Because you can have other tools used by smaller teams in that company. They're like, oh no, we want coveralls or SonarQube or some other tool. Like, why do we have to have this one? And I think that's the trade-off that you're always going to have to balance, right? The paved road should always be the easiest way to get up and running. You don't want to limit innovation because that could prevent selecting a tool that could eventually become a part of that paved road and be really helpful to everyone. But you also have to be realistic. Like, I think there's enormous friction to replacing a tool that's already there, already on the golden path. That can be great if you're the tool on the path. It can be terrible if you're not. But ultimately, like, it is a balance, but I think that it's a paved road for a reason. And these are tools that are working, they're spreading across the team, and they're doing their job well. And I think we have to accept that in a lot of cases until something comes along that's just so great that its escape velocity kind of like gets past that friction and gets along the golden path. And then 5 years later, you replace that one too. But ultimately, like, it is what it is. Like, we need this to be easy, and we pick what's easy, and there should be a higher barrier to overcome those tools that a company has defined as easy to use and works well for us. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
There's an ideal world that we are all looking for, right? Like, where every one of our developers are fundamentally just spending their time on building things that have unique value to our business and our customers, right? Like, and not spending their time on anything else, right? And none of us will ever get quite to that point, right? Like, there's a lot of things that goes beyond just writing the feature before you can get it in front of a customer, right? Like, but of course, the ideal of everything is that a new developer can jump in, just start writing code for customers, and they will immediately go live for customers, be observable, be test covered, and just work out of the box, right? Like, so even a company like Netlify, we're sort of trying to give that whole package of release management, of operations, of deployments, of rollbacks, of integrations into observability systems and so on, as like, this is just there for you, and it just works. But then, of course, like, we always have to balance that with, like, are there tools that, if you adopt them as a company, can allow you to speed up some of the processes in a way that makes you outbuild your competitors and move faster? And you want to give your developers the freedom to experiment with those, test those, prove out in projects that, hey, this could actually make us work faster, and then adopt them. And we're never getting to that. Like, I mean, there's always so many other parts to being a developer than just building production code, right? Like, but I guess the gold standard we're all trying to aim for is, like, how do we get to that world where, like, what your developers do is building value for your customers and not all the other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Ben, were you going to say something on that?
Oh yeah, I think you nailed it. Like, the golden path is important for maintenance purposes. There's only so much you can maintain. But then if you start seeing others going around the golden path and more of them are doing it, it's like a signal that your golden path is no longer serving people's needs, and maybe you can switch to a new one. So you always have to be open to having a replacement of the golden path, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say that tipping point is really hard to see.
Yeah.
Like, when you're running a company and you have 5 teams and 4 of them are using this tool successfully and one's just pushing back hard and trying to replace it, do their own thing. Like,
Yeah.
do you try to pull that team in line, or do you say, oh, there's real problems here, right? And like,
There's friction with that and
yeah,
everything.
and there's almost like there's not even a playbook. Like, you have to dig into it case by case and say, like, well, why? Why is the path not working? Okay, well, let's think about it and work through it. And if anybody knows just an automatic way to figure that out, I would love to hear that.
Yeah.
Because those battles are no fun to fight.
Yeah.
And the other part is that it's very hard to get rid of tools in reality, right? Like, so it's a lot easier to just keep adding more tools than replacing tools. Sometimes it's really important to go in and enforce some replacement rather than just addition.
Yeah, I don't see it as a golden path. I see it as like cow paths of developer tools, because it's like, what are the developers actually using instead of the ones that you designate? And then you should probably look at those, because that's increasing velocity. That's what it's more ergonomic. And so those are probably the ones I would focus on personally, rather than a golden path.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think it's kind of interesting because as engineers, we are curious, like to April's talk, right? Like we're curious, we want to practice, we want to collaborate, and so we want to try new things. And that is kind of counter to an extent to just choosing something and moving forward. But then to your point, if the developers are going to be curious and trying something new, then that's probably what you should have chosen. There's another question? Yep.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Sorry I was late, so I apologize if this is a repeat question, but #managerlife. I'm curious if y'all had discussed the kind of interoperability issue, and like more specifically, do we need to kind of have some more formal governance bodies to kind of set open standards around tooling so that we can have some more stable interfaces and kind of swap out our implementations as we can kind of innovate, without the kind of thrash that it brings into the community. So curious if that was discussed.
That's the dream, isn't it? Like, if we can get there with just open interfaces that we hot swap tools into and out of. Some of this happens, right? You've got initiatives like OpenTelemetry that I think are really starting to like show how to do this right, or at least well, maybe better than we have in the past. But it's also, if you look at businesses building tools and trying to lock you into their tool and trying to, grow and make money as a business, this is almost, it can be kind of directly antithetical to that approach, right? To like have an open standard that we all work around, because the easier I am to integrate, the easier I am to maybe swap out with somebody else. Like, I think perhaps as a community, we're getting better, point to tools like OpenTelemetry, but I don't think we're perfect. Like, there's more to do here, and I think that even as someone that runs a business that has to make money to live, I still think we can do more with standards, and it can make things better for all of us. But yeah, I think it's going to take more time. And I looked at examples like OpenTelem to maybe hopefully push us in that direction.
Yeah. Good point. Just a quick update on the editor of choice. It was between, these are the only choices, Vim.
Exactly, I saw that.
Yeah.
My choice wasn't on there.
What's your choice?
I already said it was VS Code.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
We were going to have VS Code, but it was Vim, Emacs, Notepad, or Nano. So I want to ask, of just those 4 choices, because also Mr. Swats on Discord also asked, what are your choices?
Is this the choice we hate the most, or or the one we like?
The most.
Okay.
I think the prompt was the editor you will throw down for. It does not have to be that strong of an opinion.
Text made.
Yeah. An overly honest method here is what I'll communicate. Like, it's Nano for me, because that's the one I know is going to be there when I'm SSHing into a production machine to make a hotfix I shouldn't be making. That's what it is for me. Look, Vim and Emacs are great. I cut my teeth in Notepad when I was like 10. Yeah. But yeah, it's Nano. That's where I'm headed. Yeah.
Cool.
Vim, or V. VI is always there as well.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, same. Vim.
Yeah.
Less.
Ben?
He's
like, this is
none of the
painful.
above. I guess Vim, yeah. I'll throw that in
Well,
there.
Vim is the one that won on Discord as well. So sorry, everyone. You have to use Vim now forever. Do we have a question, Sachin?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. So my question is related to people challenges. And what I've noticed over time is people become the frameworks. And we've all come across like some code where you're like, well, why is it set up like that? And then you ask someone else and they're like, well, go ask so-and-so and they're going to know about it. And then you go down this rabbit hole of like, okay, now go find the person that knows the person who knows the person. And you're terrified of making that change at the end of the day because you're like, well, I'm going to leave it because I still haven't figured out who put this change in. And so my question is, how do you sort of deal with those kind of things as you're growing up as a company?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. Like even right now, we're building a platform on top of Next.js, a development platform for everybody else. And right now, I'm the only one building it, or was the main one building it, and I don't want it to be Ben's platform, and I'm the only one who understands, and then I leave, and then all of a sudden it's like, why was it this way? So really trying to get people involved as early as possible. Multiple people bought into it, so it's really our platform instead of one person's platform. I think it's helpful. So really it's about the developer losing their ego and making it not about them, but making it a project that everybody works on so that it's not tied to any one person or any one person's decision. I found that helps.
I think tribal knowledge, which is kind of what I refer to, that's called as tribal knowledge for better or worse, is like unavoidable, right? If people are working on things, they're working in small groups or teams or individually, and like they just make decisions. You know, at Codecov, we're fully remote, globally distributed, it always has been. And so these problems, I think, surfaced a lot sooner because you just can't tap somebody on the shoulder and be like, hey, why'd you do this? And so we had to try to solve them a lot sooner, emphasis on try. You know, I can tell you now, you could go ask some of our engineers and they'd tell you that Confluence was the place where knowledge goes to die. So we're obviously not doing it great yet. But I think what I've learned about this process is you have to minimize the friction as much as possible between the developer who's making the decision and disseminating the knowledge about that decision. And if you don't make it easy through process, they'll make it easy themselves. They'll throw it in Slack and then it's gone forever, you know, or whatever. You know, to this end, you know, I try to rely on where the developers are. So usually it's a code comment, right? Like it's right there. If you're looking at the code, if you're making the edit of the change, there it is. Is it a well-developed rationale and a PR, for example? At least then I can get blame and work my way back, right? But ultimately, if you're trying to get knowledge to be disseminated in your org, you have to remove the friction. And going to a platform or going to a documentation source, like that can be friction, right? So get as close to the code as you can. That's my recommendation.
I love that because it's documentation integrated into the developer workflow.
I think also it's about encouraging the one person who's building that platform or who owns it to bring people on with them, because it's a lot to expect that person to also document and like do all the work. It's like, oh, okay, well, you're also the point person if anything breaks, but we expect you to document, write tests, like do all of these things so other people eventually can work on it, is probably a really bad way of approaching it. And so at least where I've worked, it's usually trying to get more people to work with that person. So generally when it's like the one bus problem, like this person owns that framework and knows everything about it, so if anything happens to them or they take vacation, everything is probably not gonna end well. It's about making sure that that person still, like, because I think sometimes it can be an ego problem too. It can be just like, this is my baby and like I have ownership and I don't want anyone else to take it.
And this is gonna get me a promotion.
Exactly, exactly. It's like I need all of this to myself only, but it's encouraging kind of the ability to own but also like delegate, I think. It's sort of, and I think this comes down to like management a bit too, because it's about how do you make sure that this person like feels heard and seen and also like is able to help other people along with them and bring people up. Because I think that's going back to like the promotion bit, it's actually, that is promotable work, like being able to bring people with you, not just being the one person building everything all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Low ego people do much better in these situations than high ego people, and part of it is also like some of that in some cases comes with experience, sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes I see developers early in their career, but like long enough that they're good developers, dive into a code base and conclude like, oh, all of this should be done differently because like this is not the way anymore and so on, right? Like without having the sort of lower ego and saying like probably the ones that built it were really smart people and took informed decisions for reasons at a point. And I think it's always so important to build the skill set of trying to uncover why would someone have taken this decision before questioning the decision. If you jump straight to like, I could do better without first having gone through, but wait, why did they choose this way in the first place? Was it just because like better technology didn't exist at the time when the decision was made? or was it because there was actually a set of trade-offs involved that I haven't thought through yet? That exercise when you look at a new code base is
Trade-off like time.
Yeah. Yeah, often it's time constrained, right? Like, but often those time constraint doesn't magically go away if you go in and try to redo the decision. Suddenly you find, oh wow, it's actually a very big decision to untangle. And
I want your point about ego is interesting. From experience growing companies, I think ego, company-wide ego, is kind of a reflection of the founders. Who's steering the ship, right? And if you have a CEO or CTO or leadership that can't let go of their toys, you can't expect your engineers to do it either, right? Like, you have to set that example of what promotable means, what good behavior means, what collaboration means, and that's top down as the organization grows. And I think if you do that right and you foster it right early, people have a high amount of agency. They do these things and interesting things, but they also have a high amount of empathy toward giving it to others, right? And if you enforce that behavior, you reward that behavior, that's what you're going to get. And so if you're founding a company or growing a company, you're thinking about it, like, I think an important takeaway is, like, your ego becomes your company's ego, right? And so just be very intentional about what you want your company to look like 50 or 100 people from now, and you can probably get there.
Yeah, good point. We have a question from Discord from Kanadaj.
One in the back, too.
Okay, we'll do this one first, and then we'll, I'm not pronouncing this username correctly, Kanadaj. How do you handle performance bottlenecks and code duplication in multi-language, multi-service environments, given that latency can get exponentially higher in a monolith and there is a limit to sharing code?
I have to answer the monolith question because I defended them early. Yeah, no, you're right. Latency is a problem. Performance bottlenecks can be a problem. I think the choice of a monolith, as your project grows, I think everybody gets to this point, right? Okay, it's monolith, it's performance time. What do we do? That goes back to what I said earlier about building to replace. Yep. Like, think about pieces you're going to break out and change. I think shared code is a problem no matter what it looks like, right? At Codecov, we have 3 major services. We have a 4th repository that's shared code. It's meant to be shared between those services. It's a library. And you can solve that problem either in a monolith, like, I'm at least going to architect this to break out later, or in a services model. When you approach a performance problem, especially in a monolith as it is scaling, the decision you have to make is it time to adopt the overhead of splitting, or, like, can I get in the guts of this thing and make it a little faster? And that's just going to be dictated by the problems you're experiencing at the time. There isn't a right answer, like a broad right answer, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is it depends, like everything else.
Yeah, let's just say it depends to, like, every question.
And it's very rare that the right solution at first to a performance problem is, like, another language or tool or something like that, versus first really understanding what's the architectural issue of like, most tools and languages and so on can be made performant. Then there's a couple of cases where you really are in the wrong path and it will happen, but it's like the exception and not the rule. Yeah. And you should really start by understanding, whenever you're optimizing performance, start understanding what's the, like, core thing that's really holding performance back before touching it at all. Like, trying to make something more performant just by rewriting it in Rust or something is, like, pretty much always a recipe for failure.
It is. I have a counterexample. I rewrote some Python in Rust. No, we had some performance issues with part of Codecov's backend processing, and man, we banged our heads against Python for ages. Like, there's got to be a way. And ultimately, you decide, like, okay, am I just, like, kind of gilding the lily of Python here? I can't make this any better.
It's very true.
Yeah, but you have to be diligent. Like, you have to do that.
Be really diligent. Yeah, right? Like, we've done a lot of those parts where our core service started out as a Ruby and Rails monolith, right? And of course, part of our key solution have been spinning parts of that into Go-based services and so on, right? Like, but there's a lot more work. Like, if you're just rewriting in Go, you'll get some inherent benefits in concurrency and so on, but you'll probably also then very quickly see the performance bottleneck shift to the data you're assigning to serve concurrently and to the scalability of your, like, architecture as such. So it's just always important to start by understanding, like, what's the real constraint? Have we really removed that before jumping to, like, this tool should be faster, so let's use that.
Yeah. I like that there seems to be this this trend of what we're talking about today, which is one is before you question, stop and think about how a decision was made, or whatever it might be. And then I lost my other thought. So we're going to take the next question, and then I'll maybe remember. Yeah.
I was going to kind of say a little bit more, or I wanted to have a comment on what we were talking about earlier with like how to kind of curb tribal knowledge. So I think Matt and Ellie kind of covered a lot of what I was going to say, but I think probably one of the most important things that you can do there is really kind of foster a culture of like, asking why, and not necessarily like immediately jumping into Slack and just being like, hey, XYZ, does anyone know why this is like this kind of thing? And so I've found like, as part of fostering that culture, I think kind of like teaching tooling is like really important. Like I think one of the most important things that you can do to make it a lot easier to answer the why is, number one, make very like kind of small, concise commits instead of having these giant big pull requests that are like a whole bunch of things. Because I can't tell you like how many times per day I'm using git blame to understand like, why is this like this, right? And then, going back, looking at the pull request, reading the comments or reading the description, and then just being able to be like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense, right? So I think like, kind of fostering that culture of like having really good just documentation while you're actually like, producing the code, like the actual kind of like the story of how this was made. I think that can be really important. And then just like, having people understand like how to use those tools, right? Like, I've definitely ran across people that, I do a git blame and they're like, whoa, what's that kind of thing, right? So I think that's a very important thing. I mean, we spend a lot of time like, reading code, right? And asking that question why. So yeah, I think, I don't know, I just wanted to say like, I think that a lot of that just comes from like the culture of the company, right? Because I've definitely also been places where everyone is just like immediately ready to like just go and jump to asking Slack, which at least for me, it's like I've always kind of found it's actually way slower to wait for someone to come and respond and explain something versus me just like going and figuring it out. And that might be like a little bit of like, I grew up coding and like I didn't have anyone necessarily around to like answer questions for me. So I found it was a lot faster for me to just like figure it out myself kind of thing.
Yeah. I think you're right. And some of this, though, is you have to kind of meet people where they are, right? Like, we're talking about the difficulties of imparting knowledge to other engineers as engineers. Now go try to impart that knowledge to a revenue team who needs to sell your product. Like, if your answer is go look at the git blame, they're going to go like, what? What are you talking about? And so, yes, and that bleeds into your culture point that like we not only have to be very good at sharing knowledge on ourselves as technical people, but sharing it outside of that org as well. Look, if Slack's the best tool you got for that, it's the best tool you got. But ultimately, like the cultural piece of we are here to share knowledge with others because we're all rowing this boat in the same direction. Like if you start there, you're at least you're gonna land somewhere helpful. And if it's Slack for a while and something better later, great. At least you're going somewhere.
That was the second point that I was going to make, which is asking the questions why, not just why in kind of an attacking way, but to understand. And then knowing it's okay that when organizations grow, when your product grows, that you might have to make new choices. And that seems to be like the theme that we've been kind of going into. Question?
Hello?
Yep.
So getting into web development, there is already a lot to learn, and there is so many tools. Do you guys expect juniors to know about the tools and the different things that you use, or do you onboard them and guide them, like, to use the tools? Yeah.
Good question.
Sorry, go ahead.
We built an idea of cohorts, we call it. So when we add juniors, we add a couple together that then rotates across. They'll start on what we call our foundations team that work of our core, like our core infrastructure shared between the different teams, like our design system, our deployment pipelines, and so on. They'll get a view into sort of the different languages and systems we use, and then when they start building familiarity there, they will pick like one of the final product teams to move into, so they get an overview. And in general, my philosophy there is always like fundamentals over individual tools, right? Like frameworks, especially in the front-end space, change incredibly rapidly, and even within a framework, like React today looks completely different than it did 2 years ago. On the back end, maybe the frameworks change a little slower, but it's still much more fundamental to understand, like sort of the overall questions around different models of backend engineering and what you're solving for and so on than the tools. I think like being an expert in a tool doesn't last very long. Having like really building deep experience over time, working on solving problems through programming, that lasts forever.
Yeah, I think also a matter of like trying to start with just like not a lot of tooling. So we've had interns at Fly as well, and usually we start them at like, okay, here's a really like low stakes way of getting into the product. So you don't have to do core things, because the deeper you go, the more architecture you have to know. And so it's like, okay, let's get you started by working on like the web piece of things. And it's like, here's how to run a database, here's how to run like the UI, here's how they connect, and slowly building those pieces. So it's like kind of, this is a really bad analogy, it's like a shutter of a camera opening. I'm not a photographer, but imagine it opens more than, yeah, okay, yeah. Whatever.
It's an apprenticeship.
Yes, it's an apprenticeship model. Yeah, so my first job was at a company that had an apprenticeship model, and that was sort of the same model, where it starts out being like, here's a really specific thing that you're working on, because when you're a junior, it can be really overwhelming to be given an open-ended problem. So it's very like, we're gonna be working on this particular thing, it's very specific, it's very tangible, and then you kind of like show them like, these are the tools that we're gonna be working on, and like so on and so forth, and then kind of let them explore from there, and then giving them the opportunity to ask questions. So the biggest thing, I think, is just empowering the learning environment. And
curiosity.
I think, yeah, and honestly, it permeates throughout the entire like org, because I find, even when I was at Netlify, I used to work at Netlify, there was just like a sense of learning and growth. So like one of the things I worked on was starting like a Rust learning group. And that was cool, because it was like, I was like a baby Rust engineer. But there were people who were like expert Rust engineers who would join, because to them they're always like learning new things, or they're keen on like teaching people things that they know. And so it's like, if you build that, there's like so much empowerment and so much, like it builds a very strong culture where people aren't afraid to ask questions too. Because I find like the more senior you get, the more you don't know. And it becomes more overwhelming to say I don't know things, because people expect you to know things. But if like a junior person is like, hey, I don't know this thing, it kind of empowers you to be like, yeah, I don't either actually, and we can go on this journey together. And one thing we started doing at Fly is we have an internal like forum, and we encourage people to like ask questions or post comment threads. So you can be like, hey, I noticed that we're using Nats for like pub sub reasons, like why? Or we're using Nomad, and Nomad is frustrating to use sometimes. Sorry if you work for HashiCorp. But yeah, like why did we choose to do that? And so you kind of can ask those questions and then get people to like respond and have that conversation. So it goes back to like the tooling thing, where you're not just being like, this tool sucks and I don't understand it and it doesn't make sense. It's like, hey, I actually don't know how this works, or like this decision doesn't make sense to me, why? Yeah. And it doesn't just, like if you empower a junior person to ask that, like it's just, everyone's gonna be asking questions. And I would, personally, I enjoy working in environments where that's possible, because then I'm growing and constantly developing myself.
Yeah, I think for your question, I'm gonna split my answer into like, there's tools and frameworks, right? So let's talk about the tools, the things that have like helped me to build the product, but maybe not necessarily write code. I think from the perspective of a junior, the best tools are one of two things. They're either invisible, meaning they work and the junior dev doesn't even know they're there. I think about an integration like Sentry, right? I'm getting all this exception data, but I don't know where it is in the code. Somebody did that, and I'm getting this data, and it's great. Or they're opaque. I think about a tool like Docker, right? I don't know how our Docker's orchestrated in local dev. I don't know anything about it, but if I run Docker Compose up, I get to work. And I think if you start there, if you can meet one of those two criteria for your juniors, and the juniors bring to the table kind of the one universal truth of all great engineers, just curiosity, they're going to get there, right? They will ask questions as they come up, especially if you foster a culture of asking questions, and they'll get better over time, but the tools cannot get in their way. Yeah. Like day one, they cannot. If to make a meaningful contribution to your stack, if a junior engineer is like, hey, this Docker error is happening, I had to spend 5 days fixing it, that's failure across the board. And so you always shoot for invisible or opaque, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I have one question here, which is, what are you excited about moving forward? And this can be like a particular framework, a web feature, a particular tool. In particular, maybe something that you're excited about that you think might transform our industry in some way.
So you kind of threw me with that last part about transforming the industry. I was gonna pick container queries and CSS. Like that's something that I've been dealing with like my whole developer career. Yeah. Once media queries came out, I was like, I build design systems, so in lots of cases, I don't care what the whole screen size is. I just want to know the size of this piece of element. So container queries, they're already there. I just need more browser adoption or older browsers to die. And then being able to use that as a component library author will be great.
Yeah. And I think transforming our industry doesn't mean it has to be like some completely new thing. It could also just mean that there's less friction, and that just makes us happier and able to do more. And yeah,
I'm pretty excited about like WebKit's coming support for declarative shadow DOM in web components, because it shows finally movement towards actually like building around web components and making them more generally useful. And I think that takes a while, but that's one of the things that if it works out can be pretty transformative, even in sort of a post-React kind of age, where I think we've all seen that the idea of components that we can build different types of tooling around from lots of different companies is very powerful for the UI layer of the web. And it's been really useful, like often when you are in the innovative part of a technology, it's been very useful that there was just like a team at React, kind like at Facebook, just running with React, building what they thought was useful, right? Like now I think we're tipping to a point where React is sort of becoming more and more opinionated, like more bringing a lot more complexity to its solution, which might be a great solution, but it's like a very opinionated, like integrated solution between client, server, and so on. We're starting to see like more fragmentation between React, Preact, Svelte, Vue, Solid, all these different takes on what it could look like. And I think it might be the moment of opportunity if the browser makers actually start stepping up the game around core web components to start moving on like, okay, but now that we've learned from all of these iterations, how do a true industry standard actually look like that we can build real tooling around from all kinds of different companies and vendors and so on. And that could be pretty transformative if it happens.
I'm going to use a word that Matt hates, but I'm excited for the post-Jamstack world. Because there's so much like edge infrastructure being built and more people are focusing on that. And I'm really excited for the developer experience there. Because, so my background was like, I'm a front-end, back-end, full-stack engineer, and now I'm doing platform. So I've basically run the gamut of the entire stack at this point. And it's really cool to see kind of things converging. So a lot of front-end devs being like, ooh, what's happening in the infrastructure level? And being empowered to build there, because there's a lot of companies that are sort of building platform as a service type tools. So it makes it really powerful for you to be like, I want to run a full stack app like globally without having to worry about knowing what that means, and knowing just like a little bit of infrastructure and having that power at your fingertips, which is really cool. And I'm excited to work on that. This is not like me shilling Fly.io, but it's a great company with a great product. And I'm excited to work in that space a lot because there's so much potential and I think there's a lot of growth. And like Netlify is working on a lot of that as well with like edge functions and yeah, it's cool to just see that space grow.
Definitely.
59 seconds. Do you want to do another question?
I was going to do my rapid fire. All right.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, rapid fire. No explanations. So you'll each just answer. We'll just go this way. Backend framework or language?
Go.
Go.
PHP.
Node.
Front-end framework or language?
React.
HTML.
Vue.js.
And React as well.
Okay. Web feature?
The URL.
We're not a turn. I'm not ready. I love browser extensions. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll say media queries.
Yeah.
Button type button.
Love it. Editor, not limited to those four.
VS Code, for sure.
VS Code.
VS Code.
VS Code.
It's why we didn't include it in the tool of any kind. Engineering related. Not Hammer.
Probably GitHub.
Oh, I like Tailscale. I've been using it a bunch. It's great.
Netlify.
I'm going to say Codecov then.
Yeah. And last but not least, Pokemon.
Jigglypuff.
Pikachu.
Cinderace.
I'll go with Pikachu as well.
Well, thank you so much, all four of you. This was a really great discussion. If you didn't get a chance to ask your questions, a lot of folks will be sticking around. We'll have lunch coming up very soon in the next 30 minutes. So let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.